Let me welcome you all and thank you very much for attending this event. And let me introduce my colleagues. Fadel Abdul Ghany. He is the president and director of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. And my good friend Yusuf Wahbi is the director of the Violation Documentation Center. And myself, Wael Sawah, I am the director of a newly established organization that is focusing on advocacy on justice, transitional justice, accountability, and human rights. It's a Syrian-American organization, and it will be my honor to sit with you for the first time and speak on this very delicate issue. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague Fadel in order to give you an overview of the real figures and numbers of the issue we're talking about, which is the disappearance in Syria and the death certificates which the Syrian government has released recently. So please.
Thank you very much, Wael. Actually, the aim of this event, in order to highlight very sensitive issue happened recently in Syria, that the regime suddenly, after April 2018, start to reveal the fate of the forcibly disappeared. So I'm gonna talk in three main points. First of all, I'm gonna to highlight the widespread issue about the detainees and forcibly disappeared. Then I'm gonna to go through the details about this death certificate and why the regime is doing that at this period. Then I'm gonna to have like a slight recommendation in this regard. So for this event, actually, we issued our second research in this regard, which is in your hand, and it's out, and it's on our website as well. I'll go through the report very, very briefly. So first of all, as we know that the regime start at the early stage of the uprising, arresting people. Almost 85% from those detainees amount to be forcibly disappeared. Cumulatively, Syrian Network for Human Rights Detainees Department documenting those cases. We have a huge archive. We built this archive based on daily documentation. They are working every day through different Syrian provinces in order to gather this data, and this data keep updating and keep following up the situation and the circumstances for this person, which branch, if we are able to reach to information through the families or friends or through released victims from the prisons or from the branch. That's very brief about our methodology. So we gathered actually through those years, and now we gathered huge data about the forcibly disappeared and the people who died because of torture. Now, what's in our hand actually? The Syrian government still actually have about 1,027 Syrian citizens still in detention in the Syrian detention center. About 85,000 from those are forcibly disappeared. Now, the regime is revealed the fate from those forcibly disappeared. And that's actually very surprised and strange. But also there is from those who is in the center detention actually treated very forcibly way by a high level method of torture. We have huge research about the method of torture, which is about what we are able to highlight, about 46 types of torture methods the Syrian government used to implement in the center detention. So every month, or not month, every month we have reports about the people who died because of torture. Torture being torture method or the bad circumstances for the center detention as well. Who's died because of illness or something like that, and the majority actually died because of illness. And till now, the statistics for the people who died because of torture inside the Syrian government, they killed about 13,600 persons. Those are died because of torture. We accuse that those died because of torture. Of course, what is the government said? They said that those are just died for heart strike or whatever. Sometimes they didn't even mention what is the cause of this, and that's what we're going to talk about. So the question is, what is changed actually, and why the Syrian government revealed the fate? Actually, it's difficult and it's hard to tell for sure what the Syrian government goal is. I think that there is two main points in this regard. First of all, that the Syrian government want to show that they win the conflict, and they want the community to accept their winning, and they want to shock them with this truth, and by the time the community will accept, they don't have any other option in their hand. The other theory, in my opinion, that the Russian actually request this from the regime, from the Syrian government. And what is the aim of the Russian? They want actually also to show that the conflict is ended by handling the detainees file, and by also handling like the refugees. They requested the refugees to be back to Syria as well. So they want that they are controlling everything. This is my first point. Now my second point is I want to go in details to analyze the figures itself. We have been able to verify 836 cases. The regime or the Syrian government, revealed their fate. If we go through in details for this figure, I have several points to be highlighted. First point, that the majority of them from Damascus suburb, then 193, then from Homs, then from Hasaka. So we distribute these figures to the provinces in order to show the percentage. The second point, most of those whose fate were revealed were arrested in 2011 and 2012. what we did actually, we have those new cases, so we make comparing and matching each person we take, and we search based on our data. And so we take information, where is this arrested, which date, based on our data, based on previous information. So we found that most of those are arrested in 2011 and 2012. The third point, that most cases are forcibly disappeared person at Sideline prison, branch 2015 and branch 215 and branch 227. So most of those, the final information about their fate was from those, mainly from those 3 centers detention. Fourth point, we found cases of need, cases of kinships, father and uncles, wives. So we found about 41 enforced disappearance in between those 836 cases that involve kinships. My colleague mentioned that 3 minutes, but I'm gonna to take from your time because okay, I'll be a little bit faster. Now, I'll jump for those details, but I think I need to highlight 1 or 2 points before I finish. That the government revealed the fate not by contact the family directly. They didn't even give them this honor that your son or your lovers is dead. No, they informed them by very brutal way, through surprise. At the beginning, and we surprised as an expert. This is the first time happened that family visit the civil registry to do normal transaction, and the employee there informed them that your relative is registered in our record as a dead person. So the family is shocked actually. The normal procedure that in Syria, and I think in other countries, that you go to the civil registry in order to register one of your family as a dead person. Here in contrary, the civil registry informed the Syrian family that your lovers is dead. Now, what's happened after this, when this news is published in the Syrian society, it's happened at beginning in Homs and in Latakia and in Hama. Then the Syrian society, which they have relative forcibly disappeared, they now jump to visit the civil registry before they visit the security forces branches. Now they visit the civil registry centers in all around Syria provinces in order to check what is the fate of their lovers. From those family and from the death certificate issued by the Syrian government, and from the list, also the Syrian government start to hang a list of names about those. We gathered those cases, which is very, very strange. in the death certificate, there is no mention at all for the reason of death. And in this regard, I'm going to highlight very information without body. So those in our data is still considered as forcibly disappeared person, even if the one of the government institute or the government body informed the family that this person is dead. Without body, we cannot consider that as a real actually reveal. And the second point in this specific issue that the Syrian government is the side who is accused that those people is forcibly disappeared by the government, and this is the same side who is revealing the fact. So this is very very sensitive in the international law. And my final point, Wael, that there is two dates in the death certificate. One date, it's mentioned maybe, we don't sure, but what's the Syrian government mentioned, we think that this date is the actual date of death. The second date is when the civil registry is received these cases, and all of those second date is after April 2018. And there is 9 children included in this figures, and 1 ladies. I think I jump my time, and I will lift the recommendation and the accountability talk totally to my colleague Yusuf Wahbi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending this event, and also, of course, really sincere thanks also for the sponsors of this event. I would like just to have a brief highlight on the some legal aspects related to the issue of the Syrian authorities' declaration or releasing of such death certificates or lists. Although I'm representing here the Violations Documentation Center, but I'm going to step down because maybe Fadel and the Syrian network has done already a lot of work and professional actually outcomes related to this issue. Well, following the issue of death lists and the falsified death certificates issued by the Syrian authorities, claiming the natural death of persons who were in custody for years, reminds me with the Pinochet's era in Chile. That dictatorship used this tool of fake death certificates to undercover the reality of committing thousands of enforced disappearance crimes against arbitrarily detained persons who were usually tortured to death, and their fate and or their bodies and remains were never delivered to their families. As if history is just repeating itself, the Syrian Arab Republic nowadays is witnessing the same experience, of which it deprives the victims and their families from their right to know, justice, and reparation. The enforced disappearance of victims in custody is meant to be ended by the Syrian authorities by issuing such notes of death due to natural reasons. In addition to thousands of testimonies on the horrors of torture and ill treatment in the detention centers in Syria, the horrible photos of Caesar File shall always be a clear and undebated evidence of the kind of systematic use of torture and ill treatment by the Syrian authorities. The Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearance has regularly refused the practice of issuing death certificates as an accepted means of clarification by the states for the disappearance. The cause of death must be investigated, meaning that there is a need to exhuming and re-examining bodies or doing forensic checks on original autopsy reports. The jurisprudence of inter-American and European courts is very clear that strong presumptions of fact against the state will arise in respect of injuries and death occurring during detentions, The burden of proof is resting on the authorities to provide a satisfactory and convincing explanation of the death. Both courts have stated that people in custody are in a vulnerable position and the authorities are under a duty to protect them. The obligation of the authorities to account for the treatment of an individual in custody is particularly stringent when that individual dies. So, a simple death certificate with the cause of death as heart attack, without an autopsy, proper investigation, similar language used in many cases, etc., would not survive the scrutiny of the judiciary requirements. Moreover, these death certificates or notes to the families are still considered as means of concealment of the whereabouts of the disappeared person, thus keeping that person classified as a forced disappearance according to the definition in the International Convention of the Protection for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. It is essential also to highlight the fact that no circumstances whatsoever, whether a threat of war, state of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency may be invoked to justify enforced disappearances as stipulated in the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. In this context, neither the authorities' issuance of death certificates nor any justification is considered as an excuse or an amnesty from the continuing crimes of arbitrary detention, torture, murder, and enforced disappearance. We at the Violations Documentation Center and the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression have already started a series of advocacy efforts and activities targeting different states and stakeholders about the seriousness of the Syrian authorities' attempt to distort the truth and undermine the accountability and justice paths. It's really concerning that many stakeholders at the international level still dealing with this issue as a matter of statistics, while the implications of such approach do not constitute an ongoing violation of international law only, but it threatens any realistic and practical transitional justice in the future Syria, based on justice, societal reconciliation, and reparation. The international mechanisms commissioned by the documentation and investigation of crimes committed in Syria have to prioritize this issue, as it is an attempt by the Syrian authorities to escape any legal obligations that might be imposed based on the accumulated facts of its officials perpetrating and committing these grave violations and crimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. On September 20, 2012, a friend of mine, her name is Fadel Mahmoud, was making dinner at home. Her husband was in a visit to China, and he was coming back home after having a series of meetings with the Chinese government. She didn't want to go to the airport to pick him up because she was busying herself doing the dinner, so she sent her son Maher to pick him up. Her son gave her a call on the way back. He said, we are on our way back. I picked up my dad and we will be home soon. They never arrived home. It was later that we knew that Abdulaziz al-Khayyar, who is one of the moderate opposition leaders, was abducted by the forces of the Syrian government, and we have never heard anything about him ever since. A few weeks later, another friend of mine, a very well-known, renowned lawyer and human rights activist, Khalil Matou, was going to his office with a friend of his in the friend's car because he couldn't drive because he was very ill to drive. And the friend spoke with his wife, telling her that they were that he was driving Khalil to his office and he would be back home after that. Both of them disappeared. We don't know anything about either of them ever since. Before that, an actor and activist, Zaki Cordello, was the security services dashed into his house very early in the morning of one day of 2012, and they took him and his son. We don't know anything about their whereabouts. We don't know anything about their conditions. And the fourth one is another friend of mine. His name is Ali Shihabi. He was also kidnapped from one of the streets near Yarmouk camp, and we don't know anything about him or his whereabouts. Zaki Cordello is a Sunni Muslim. Abdulaziz Khayer is an Alawite. Khalil Matouk is a Christian. Ali Shahabi is a Palestinian. The Syrian government has always been very fair in distributing the repression on the Syrian citizens or the Palestinian citizens who lived in Syria. I have many other friends to speak about, but I'm not here to speak about my friends actually. I'm here to speak about this extraordinary issue, which I think is very, very rare, and it has no precedent in the bureaucratic repression all over the world. And we know that the forced disappearance is not new in Syria. We have experienced that in the past. We experienced it in the 1970s and 1980s, where thousands of people disappeared and no one knew anything about them. But what we are facing here now is a new, as my both colleagues, and I don't want to repeat what they said, we are facing a new phenomenon. The government is proud to announce that these people were killed in the detention. I personally am not aware of any other government that has proudly announced this situation, except maybe for the Iranian government in the 1980s. So the question is, why do we have to sit here now and discuss this issue? First, the forced disappearance has not ended in Syria. It's still continuing, it's still going on. So we are not talking about something that belongs to the past. It is a continuous ill practice that is harvesting Syrians almost every day. Secondly, after years of the government's silence about the fate of tens of thousands of Syrians who have forcibly disappeared, authorities this year have begun quietly updating registers to acknowledge hundreds of deaths. Starting in April, families began discovering what happened to their beloved people by chance when they visited the, as Fadel said, the civil registry to obtain civil paper like a birth certificate or to register a newly born baby. They go to the registry, and the registry surprises them, again as Fadel said, by telling them that so-and-so in your family has died. Zaina is a young woman. She was leaving the office crying her heart out. She just learned that her husband, who was arrested in 2014, had been announced officially dead. The cleric of the civil registry said she did not know the cause of the death. Many death certificates said that it was heart attacks. But the most humiliating cause that some families heard is that their beloved people committed suicide because they felt ashamed of what they had done. By playing this game, the government believes that it has found a way to get rid of the liability, the responsibility towards thousands of forced disappeared people. One, it believes that once the fate of the disappeared is known, they are not considered disappeared anymore. Thus, the government will turn a page here. Wrong. The person remains disappeared until they are released or their bodies are delivered to their families, and they are confirmed to be their relatives using the modern mechanisms and like DNA analysis and so on. Then a forcibly disappeared person will become a casualty victim of a crime against humanity. 2, the government thought that the declarations and documents of death would change the categorization of the victims. Wrong. The provisions of international law pertaining to forced disappearance continue to apply to them. In the first place, those documents are themselves suspicious and do not provide clear and ultimate answers, as the entity, as Fadel said also, as the entity that issued them is the very side which kidnapped and tortured them in the first place. And 3, the government believed that when the family of the forcibly disappeared extract death certificate for their relatives, they give the government a chance to evade legal responsibility for the disappearance. Wrong. Neither the issuance of death documents by the authority nor the extraction of death certificates by the families has any effect on the right of those people to know the fate of their forcibly disappeared sons and daughters, or any of their other rights, such as the rights to hold accountable these people responsible for the crimes of disappearance and arbitrary detention and torture and extrajudicial execution. In the end, resolving the issue doesn't end here, especially as the widespread and systematic extent of detention and forced disappearance and torture by the government makes these acts crimes against humanity, which means the resolution of the issue and justice for the victims can only happen through 1, an independent investigation to justice for the victims can only an independent investigation to determine the circumstances that led to the perpetration of these crimes and the entities and individuals responsible for them. 2, pursuing and prosecuting those responsible for these crimes. And 3, reparations for the damage suffered by the victims of detention and disappearance and their families. And finally, taking the legal measures and reform necessary for the security agencies and judiciary so as to prevent the repetition of these violations in the future. Finally, one last word. It is very, very important for all of us, not for the Syrian people only. The Syrian nation is a small nation. So we're talking about 23, 24 million people before the killing of at least a million Syrian people who were killed by either in torture, under torture in prison, or by explosive barrels, or by missiles, or of hunger and siege, etc. But it's still a small nation, and the only thing that I fear about is that this becomes a precedence, and governments elsewhere will learn the good practices of the Syrian government and play according to the playbook of the Syrian government and evade any responsibility and any accountability for the deeds and the crimes against humanity they do. We are obliged to face the situation. We are obliged not to allow the Syrian government to escape the crimes it made. And this is not only, it is for the Syrian people, but it's not only for the Syrian people. It's for the international world. It's for all of us, and it's for our conscience, and it's for the new generations when we tell them the history that happened before, and we tell them that there was a criminal government that we stopped it from killing and kidnapping its own people. Or the other alternative is that there was a criminal government that we were not able to stop, and eventually this epidemic spread all around the world. In the end, I would like to thank very much the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expressions for hosting this event, and also thank the sponsors who supported the event, the governments of Switzerland, Denmark, and Liechtenstein. And we have a few minutes, so if there is any question or remark, we welcome that. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Permanent Representative of Liechtenstein here in Geneva, and I would just like to thank the organizers for hosting this very important event. I think it is very timely. We're very worried about this new practice of the Syrian government because it has the potential to seriously undermine accountability, transitional justice. You mentioned that. I think this is very important. And I think also the issue of the enforced disappeared people, it has to be on the agenda because it will be a crucial issue for in the transitional justice period, but also beyond. And as we strongly believe in accountability, I think it is really very important to shed light on this practice and to do advocacy for it. Our foreign minister, together with the foreign minister of Qatar, and together with 40 other states, have recently also sounded alarm in the Security Council and the General Assembly about this practice of issuing death certificates, and to call to the attention of the international community. We are also pleased, or I think also today the Commission of Inquiry also mentioned this practice. I think this is very important, and we are also pleased to see a reference to this practice in the draft resolution on Syria. And maybe if you have some advice for us, for member states, or what we can do, or what the international community can do to bring this practice to an end, I would appreciate it. And thank you again for your important work.
Sir, I can speak on behalf of my colleagues and myself. I would like to assure you that the Syrian people are very, very grateful to your government and to all the governments that are still standing in the face of repression and injustice, unlike many other governments which are changing their position vis-a-vis what's happening in Syria, either because they have become tired or because they have maybe spent a lot of money on this case. So thank you very, very much, and it will be our honor if we exchange contacts now after the event, and then we definitely will be happy in order to communicate with you on the best practices.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And it will be my honor also to join the event in New York with your Prime Minister, with your Foreign Minister. But I have one recommendation, and it's mentioned in our research about this sensitive topic, that I think it's worth to have emergency meeting for the Security Council to discuss this very critical matter. It's threatened, as we mentioned, 95,000 of Syrian citizens. So it's threatened almost that maybe more than half of the society. Myself, I know that almost it's affect almost of our society. It's worth to have this Security Council meeting, and we need to push forward in this regard. And I have also other recommendation in this regard, that we need actually further step from OHCHR as well. The Commission of Inquiry did a great job, and I here welcoming my colleague Lubna from the Commission of Inquiry. She is attending here, but I think the OHCHR must actually take like further step in this very sensitive topic, and shoot statement or release a thematic report in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you once again, sir, for your kind words and encouragement. I would like also to raise the voice again on behalf of VDC and SCM together, and maybe many other organizations, that we share the same perspective, that we do believe that it's the time right now to take the international mechanisms established by the international bodies, to take it a step further. It's a matter of documentation, investigation, but the accountability and justice need actually to be need a starting point. We believe that it's a crucial point now, a crucial time, to start thinking about going into other avenues rather than the Security Council blocked by the Russian and the Chinese probably, and the referral to ICC, and starting thinking about, for example, a special tribunal for Syria through the General Assembly. That might be one of the things that we can think about, we can mobilize for. At least for the Syrian people, there would be a kind of first step. They feel that there is still hope in international justice. Otherwise, actually, we are working on litigation. We are working on using the universal jurisdiction stuff. But at some point, the Syrian victims themselves are really depressed and feel that, okay, this is going to nowhere. So this is my only recommendation. So thank you.
Okay, we have maybe one last chance for a comment or a question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. It's not related to exactly what you've been presenting, and I thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm just interested because you said that this, one of the explanations that you gave for the release of those test certificates is also an attempt for kind of normalization of what's happening in Syria. I was wondering if the situation has changed currently for civil society in Syria in any way, if you see any positive trend, or to the contrary, even more repression in the current stage, as if there has been any evolution. Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you very much for this very important question and remark. Actually, yeah, everybody knows that the situation is changing on daily basis, and on the ground, we see that the Syrian government is can you hear me? The Syrian government is making real progress with its allies, the Russians and the Iranians and the other militias, and it's gaining real progress on the ground, which makes the space in front of the independent civil society much narrower. We must learn how to find new avenues in order to reach out to the Syrian people. This will be more difficult, and we need to be more creative in order to reach that. there is a very important point from my point of view. The civil society is not a political party, and it doesn't carry a political agenda. And in this, from this angle, it needs to create, to find always new mechanisms and new ways to deal with the Syrian people. And the Syrian civil society, whether inside or outside Syria, represents the entire Syrian people. We will not represent only one section, one segment of the Syrian people. We represent the entire Syrian people, and in this case, we will always find challenges, and we will try to find ways in order to overcome these challenges. I'm afraid we need to stop here because we need to evacuate the room before they kick us out. But I want again to thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen, for each and every one of you to spare the time to come and listen to us, and I hope we will continue communicating later. Thank you again.